just like to welcome everybody to this Lessons Learned from On-Demand Transit RFPs. I'd like to really take a moment to welcome our panelists. We've got Sam Treblecock with a Senior Planner with the City of Sioux Falls. And we have Stephen Hunt, who is the Development Director with Valley Regional Transit, servicing Treasure Valley, encompassing Boise and the surrounding areas. So thank you very much for taking time to share your experiences. I think that you guys are part of a leading trend who've already participated and deployed some on-demand technology, on-demand transit technology in your territories. And I think it's important that we maybe define a little bit about what on-demand is for those in the audience. And interested to get your perspective, Stephen. How would you tell others what on-demand transit technology is all about?
Well, so on-demand transit it's evolving, I think, in terms of definitions. And that's one of the things that I was going to get into in a little bit more detail later on, was definitions matter. And even using the same words of on-demand within the procurement matters, and how people hear that and what people are proposing. You need to make sure that you understand kind of where they're getting at. So, but broadly speaking, when we talk about on-demand, we're talking about services that respond to rider needs when they happen. And so if you have, as opposed to a fixed schedule. So the easiest way that I always understood on-demand is just comparing it to a fixed schedule or fixed route. And on-demand is not fixed route or fixed schedule. And so one definition is it encompasses everything else. So paratransit might be defined as on-demand. The old dial-a-ride types of services are a version of on-demand, but what we're experiencing now with the innovations in on-demand is an application that's similar to Lyft or Uber, where you've got an in-the-moment opportunity to schedule a public transit ride. And so I think for a lot of people that sparks a vision of what on-demand is, but it's services that are not scheduled or pre-planned.
Right. Well, when we first entered public transit and we were giving our pitch to different people, someone said, well, that's just like the dial-a-bus service that we were trying to offer in the 70s, right? And immediately they'd run into challenges when it got too popular, right? Because how many people can you have answering phones and organizing bus schedules for on-demand rides? You'd hit a theoretical limit of how many people you could service with one dispatcher, right? And we see that in paratransit, which is why dispatch optimization technology has been around for quite some time, right? So you take in your series of rides, plan it the night before, and then it will give you a schedule for the following day. But on-demand changes that, where you can start, it will self-heal and do its own scheduling without the necessity of having a human dispatcher, schedule those trips. So I think it's interesting to kind of set that tone. So each of the gentlemen here have taken some time to pull together, kind of a comment about the type of service that they were, going to RFP for. And I thought a good way to start this conversation off is to share examples. And full disclosure, Pantonium did participate in each of Sioux Falls and Valley Regional's RFP processes. We weren't successful in both, but we definitely appreciate each of you taking time to share your learnings about those processes. So without going any deeper, Sam, I'd like to turn it over to you first, maybe to kind of take us through what City of Sioux Falls process looked like, and then we can have a little bit of discussion about that. And then Stephen, we'll move on to your conversation after that, if that's fine with you. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks for having me this afternoon. So what I'm going to start off by doing is seeing how well I can share my screen. So. And go into presentation mode. It worked when we tried it just before you guys got on. And if I have to, I'll just.
You could just walk us through, Sam, just with the.
Yeah.
You could just slide the left window a little smaller, and there you go. And you make the notes section a little smaller, and then it almost looks the same. So.
Right.
Perfect.
So again, yeah, I'm Sam Trebelkonk. I'm senior planner with City of Sioux Falls, and we work a lot with our transit provider, Surrey Metro. And what I wanted to be able to do is kind of take you through our whole process, because it really kind of helps explain, how we came up with our RFP. And I think it is really important to explain our process to be able to understand what our goal was in this particular case. In terms of the basics, early on, when our mayor was elected, he identified transit as a critical issue to innovate. Like a lot of transit systems around the country, ridership is down. We're having financial issues, trying to figure out how to finance our capital, some really significant issues. So he was saying right off the bat, we need to do something with transit. Now, first of all, Surrey Metro at the time, does not currently have an on-demand service until very, very recently, except for, the paratransit, more of the kind of the dial the ride sort of service. The project that we're doing was really funded by our transit fund. So it was, federal and local money that we put together as a part of this our whole fund. And then really the project took over 2 years from beginning to end. And you'll kind of see why as we kind of go through this, why like anything else, it does take a while to go through it. So as I mentioned, our mayor was really interested in looking at this as a project of public sector innovation. He's really a big believer in looking at innovation and looking at how that process can generate ideas and create values for the community. So the way we kind of went through that is we were looking at innovation teams, which were really a small group of people tackling real world challenges and learning and applying those innovation principles. And inclusive, or really you're focusing our particular innovation teams, and I'll show you the one that we chose in a second, is really focused on cross-departmental and cross-sector issues. So our innovation team, this was our transit core innovation team that really dug into transit. It was cross-departmental, 14 people from different departments. We had parks and IT and planning and finance, health, as I look across the group here, fire even, library, and all of us came together and spent a significant amount of time together. In part, some of the people even here, we had people from that helped us through the process to determine how to go through, and you can see the boards behind. We had a lot of sticky notes and all kinds of things trying to figure out what we should be innovating in transit. It's a unique process. Our mayor is in the back there. He was very engaged in the process and very supportive of the process. We thought that was really important. So really it was looking to develop innovative solutions using kind of a process called co-creation, engaging with stakeholders, the public, and with, more than anything, with riders too, to find out what kinds of solutions we should be looking at to help innovate transit in Sioux Falls. So our main pilot, or our main goal, was to look at a way to innovate our fixed route system or our mass transit system. So our pilot goal was to understand and how, I'm going to move there. Sorry about that. One second. My window is getting in the way. Understand how and if mass transit and on-demand can increase service and service area and hours while meeting operational and economic requirements. So that was our pilot goal. And I really wanted to read that because that's very important for, you know, putting together your RFP. This is your goal. This is what you're scoping out as your goal. You need to stick with that. So I wanted to make sure that you guys, you know, understood that. So we then move forward into, as part of our core team, a pilot scope, design, install, test, market, operate, and iterate. Really important function is that we could actually iterate as we went into this. As part of innovation, you don't want to just know for sure what you're exactly doing. You're going to move through that process of innovation. Using existing bus fleet to schedule same-day rides via an app, computer, phone service, shared rides. You can see all the different things we're looking at, even launching on Saturdays, which is what we are doing. So that's an important function also we did, is to look at the pilot scope. Again, we're looking at Saturdays. We decided it was important to look at the same service area we're doing with our fixed route service, doing that mass transit on-demand service. And then, yes, we even went through a timeline, although this changed, but we are planning, you know, what does it need to look like? To some degree, we maybe even over-planned this, but you don't want that to completely get in the way, but it's important to plan that timeline and what you're going to do. So the RFP itself, what we do in Sioux Falls, our procurement manager at the city of Sioux Falls managed the process. I think it's important, regardless of who it is, that you do have somebody that is managing the process for the team that you have. We had a selection committee. We had somebody from our Public Transit Advisory Board that was a member, our GM from Surrey Metro. We had a city council member, and then several members of our transit core team were also members of that selection team. Again, it's developing that support. You want to carry that support. And we did that as part of the core team also, is to engage the public throughout the process. Now, in terms of the RFP details, it was determined by our core team in large part, as I was just talking about. Surrey Metro, of course, was very much involved as we got near the end, and our Public Transit Advisory Board. But really, that's difficult. We needed to research from other on-demand pilots, what their RFPs were like. We were talking and engaging with other systems or on-demand systems. We were interviewing them throughout the process, talking to them, getting demos, trying to learn more about it. You just really got to immerse yourself in that. And then going back to it, it's really important that you base it on the goals that you have set up for the process. Always go back to that initial goal. So our selection, we had 8 proposals that we received in February of 2020. We interviewed and did demos with 3. Our RFP committee scored all proposals, and there's a standardized scoring sheet that we have, and that's, I think, really important to do, so that as much as possible, you can get all the selection team members on the same page. Now, our decision, of course, was delayed by COVID, so that was, we could go into, you know, a whole thing just on that, but it was delayed. We did end up selecting Pantonium in spring 2020, and contract was approved by fall of 2020. I put that in there because don't forget that part of the timeline. Just going from and negotiating the contract and getting the approval process for your contracts. I think you may be a lot aware that it does take some time. So our on-demand mass transit pilot, in terms of implementation, detailed discovery was in mid-October. We had our training in late October, public engagement in early November, and marketing. Our pilot started on December 19th, so it's really new. Our term, we have essentially a full 4.5-month pilot, 6-week warm-up. We just finished warm-up last Saturday, and starting the pilot this Saturday, full pilot, and going from there. So a few other things that Jeremy was bringing up as we were kind of looking at this. What's changed during your RFP process? Just kind of some of the preferences from the RFP committee. And that's what's important to always go back to the goal. Sometimes when you have the RFP committee looking at these, it's really kind of easy to find the presentations. Sometimes they're really maybe glitzy and impressive and all those kind of things, but you always got to go back to, are they fulfilling what the goal is of what we want to do? Always going back to that is really important. And so sometimes you got to move from those, hey, I really like this, to what are we trying to get done here? What went well in the RFP process? I really thought the structure of our process made it go pretty smoothly. And I think that's important to have a really sound structure. Was most difficult. Again, it was difficult to write the specs, and I think that's an important piece of what we're talking about here today. What to keep in mind, again, goals and the scope. Always go back to that, really important. What would we want to change? Managing expectations, it's really hard for us to sometimes get everybody to understand that this isn't going to necessarily change the world. It's a piece of the puzzle, and I think that's something that we're trying to work through as we work through the pilot too. Best advice for on-demand transit: don't just do it because it's trendy. Do it because you really think this is something that can help your operations, your service to your customers. Really find that that niche that you're trying to provide. So with that, I'd take questions, or I'm sure maybe saving questions for later, but thanks for the time.
Thanks, Sam. If you want to minimize your screen share, I would like to go through and take the questions from the attendees, because some of them are actually really interesting. So Pamela White has asked a few different questions, Sam, and I think they're all pertinent. So could you describe, she said, did this replace service or did this extend service? So just if you could clarify what the purpose and intent of the deployment was, and kind of talk about numbers too, like how many buses and that type of thing. So
right. So in our particular case, what's really important that we're trying to it's getting back to that goal, is we're trying to determine whether or not we can do on-demand service more efficiently than our fixed route service in certain circumstances. So we looked at Saturday because we know our Saturday service had less ridership, certainly had less riders per hour on especially certain routes. So this particular area was replacing services for the entire fixed route. We have essentially 10 fixed route in which 8 buses are out there at any one time. And so we're running this on-demand service within that Saturday service area. So it's really interesting, and you know, through the warm-up, we've worked through some issues, of course, but so far we've been able to run it with fewer buses than we currently have out there, typically on a Saturday.
And Pamela also asked, why was it important to start on a Saturday? What was the, why not choose other services? Why Saturday?
Yeah, I mean, we did. We looked at and we looked at evenings. That was a possibility, but we decided we wanted to do something that made the most sense, so that the customers knew that it was going on during that day. At that particular time, evenings, we were a little worried that how do you make the cut between fixed, and I know it can be done, but we just wanted to do something that seemed a little bit more clean. And we also knew that if we started on Saturdays, we had a little bit more time in between to make adjustments. And actually, that's been helpful for us in this particular case.
Right. There's a lot of other questions that have come up, but I want to wait. I'm going to save those till later because I think I'd like to get both you and Stephen to weigh in on them. And so some of these questions, folks in the audience, we will get to, but I'm not going to ask them just to Sam only. And we'll get to kind of the broader picture questions after Stephen's had a chance to go through his scope of services and his process.
So, would you like me to jump in there?
Just one really quick, Sam. Okay. There was one question, Sam, that I think is particular to yours, and that was, sorry, there's a lot of questions popping up, so I'm just trying to go through them here. And it might have either got moved around. I apologize, there's just a number of things here. I guess one question is how long was the tendering process? One fellow had a question about that.
So maybe explain tendering process. So I'm not, what do you mean by tendering?
So I think it was from the point from where you made the decision for the RFP to where you got to contract. How was that was that close to? Okay,
gotcha. So, well, I mean, our process, you can kind of tell, I mean, it was interrupted by COVID. But if it wouldn't have been, I mean, the process probably would have taken, you know, I mean, from the time that the contract was adopted, from when we issued the RFP, probably 4 or 5 months.
Right. And then I guess the other question was actually in the chats, and it was, what was the 6-week warm-up period that we, you know, I'll let you talk about that, but I can offer some color there too. But what was the 6-week warm-up period for?
So, you know, warm-up is essentially and to get us through to work through, because it is really new. You want to make sure you're working through all the details to make sure that what you have, and for instance, you know, the number of buses that you have out there versus how the software is working with it, to make sure it's working smoothly enough that you can start to rely on your statistics. And I think that's really, you know, Jeremy, you probably could answer a little more specifically, but that's what I understand it.
Yeah, so from our perspective, when we're doing deployments, some of the areas are not so large, but Sioux Falls in particular is a very large deployment. It's got a large service area that was previously serviced by 10 full-size bus fixed routes, has 200,000 people, a lot of stakeholders, a lot of drivers, a lot of folks in the offices. So it takes longer to get all those folks trained through change management. And so it may not take as long with a smaller operation, but with Sioux Falls, we wanted to make sure that it was rolled out in stages so that each person could vote and say that they were comfortable moving to the next step, right? You know, there's no point in pulling people along if they're not ready yet. So we just want to make sure that we had that time allocated. So, so Sam, I'd like to kind of end the Sioux area metro conversation for now and put it on pause till we get let Stephen have some time to kind of walk through their area, because what I like about On-Demand Transit is that the applications are very different, right? There's no two that are exactly the same, and they can take different forms. And so I'm very, very happy to have Stephen here to talk about his application as well.
Thank you, Jeremy. I'll go ahead and share my screen as well. And so Stephen Hunt with Valley Regional Transit, and I'm the development director there. Valley Regional Transit, as was mentioned, operates in the Treasure Valley, which includes Boise, Nampa, Meridian, Caldwell, within the state of Idaho. So kind of Southwest Idaho, that's where we're at. And what this on-demand application did was it looked at 3 underperforming, infrequent routes that served Nampa, Caldwell, and some Canyon County. The ridership was pretty low. It actually started, though, because of a conversation we were having with one of our funding partners. And so one thing that colors, I think, our whole process is the fact that our local dollars come from voluntary contributions of each jurisdiction that we serve. So meaning when a jurisdiction says we need to change something or else you're not going to get funding next year, that tends to have a bit of weight on our decisions. So we were looking at, one of our funding partners is the College of Western Idaho, which is in Nampa, and they had a special service that connected several of their remote campuses. And that's the Route 55 you can see on the screen. And it was open to the public, but it really was trying to target students who are traveling between campuses. And it was getting essentially no riders. I mean, very, very low ridership, half a rider an hour, something like that. And so they were looking at a way that they could get better utilization while still serving that population. So that's where our initial exploration into on-demand began, was, is there a way we could replace just the Route 55? And those conversations kind of grew over time, and we realized that for what we were trying to do, there might not be a whole lot to optimize by just replacing a single route. And so the project ended up growing into replacing all three of those routes, the 55, the 51, and the 52, replacing them all with on-demand service. And the desired outcomes of the project was to increase the number of destinations that we could get to, increase ridership, at least on segments of it. And in the case of College of Western Idaho, their specific interest was to see ridership grow on their service. The city of Nampa was also interested in seeing ridership, the productivity of service grow, and the cost per rider go down. One of the things that we were facing in Canyon County generally is as the region is growing, it's currently about 160,000 people between Nampa and Caldwell, and we're trying to cover that whole area. It's not all of incorporated Nampa and Caldwell, but it is the main portions of those cities. But they're growing, and new places are popping up that are off of the old fixed line network. So the coverage area that we had before really wasn't keeping up with where development was going to. There's a new Amazon fulfillment center that was brought online recently, and it was off of our fixed route system. And so we were trying to find ways, how do we extend our reach into areas that we currently don't serve without having to necessarily generate a whole new route for it. The other thing that was a little bit unique in Nampa was we'd identified some different food deserts that happened to correlate with transit deserts, just meaning there were people who didn't have access to basic services, nor did they have access to transit. And also those were low-income areas within the city of Nampa. So we were trying to find, is there a way we could serve those populations in a more meaningful way than our current fixed route service did? So the constraints, though, that we were working under is that this service was replacing existing service. The ongoing operations of this would be funded with the current operating budget. So we had to work within our existing resources, and we were trying to maximize current assets. So we used our transit vehicles. We were repurposing our existing bus stops and our operators. And the way this project evolved, it ended up having to meet a relatively short time frame. I suppose if you mark the first time we thought on-demand transit to when we deployed, it was more than 12 months. But by the time we got serious about saying, okay, this is something that needs to happen, it was down to about a 12-month turnaround that we needed to deliver this service. And that was driven in large part by the needs of our partners. So in the end, we ended up developing an on-demand system that I hope you can see the light green shading on that on that map that extended the reach of transit beyond where it had been. We were able to then market those new locations, new destinations that were open to the public. One of them being actually the high schools. There were a number of high schools that were just, not even just, maybe a mile and a half off of the fixed route system that we were trying to pull into the transit universe, because we needed to grow the number of places that could use transit in our clientele. And so that was one of the other elements that we wanted to gain by moving to on-demand, is increasing the number of institutions or locations that have an interest in taking and using transit. This actually is just a cut up of the brochure that we now have for the on-demand service. And it's an important thing to think about, is how do you communicate what the on-demand service looks like to the public, and particularly if you're coming from fixed route and then replacing that with something on demand. There's just a sense that, like, what does your schedule look like? There actually is no schedule, right? And so how do you communicate to the riders the process that they're going to have to go through to call for a bus, and how do you illustrate to the riders where they can get on buses? And so this was our attempt to try and do all of that, and it does, I think, harken back to like fixed route ideas, right? So we're talking about it. We need a map. We need something that shows the extent. We need something that gives people an idea of when service is available. All of those things are still important to be able to communicate, but the way you communicate it changes a little bit. So to get to the RFP process, I want to just focus on a couple of items, which is, as was already mentioned, it's really important that you have a clearly defined set of goals going into your RFP process. And so ours were, we wanted to increase productivity of service. We also knew that we would be using existing operators and vehicles, so it was important that we had operations involved from the beginning, so that they understood like how will this be rolled out, and what does it mean for operators? Like, when do they take breaks on an on-demand system? Like, there's no kind of set layover, or at least scheduled layover. So figuring out how do you make sure that all of those operational things are considered in the new on-demand world. And as I mentioned, what does that look like as you interface with the public? So we did implement a whole lot of new virtual stops, which actually had no physical manifestation. There was no bus stop there, but we maintained access at all of the existing bus stops and had signage at those bus stops that included information about how to call for a ride. The other thing that I wanted to mention about the RFP process is our approach to how to evaluate the proposals was maybe a little bit different, in the sense that we did have, I mean, it's all usually an RFP process leads to some kind of scoring and evaluation in a numeric fashion. And we have been, as an organization, trying to shift that away from like a strictly numeric evaluation to something we call best value, which is identifying what are the strengths of one proposal and what are the weaknesses of that proposal. And if you can, I mean, sometimes we think about interviews as just getting more information from the proposer, but using that more as an opportunity to say, here are some things that we need in order to make this better, like, and have that be more of a discussion than like, did you get the answer right? Does that make sense? Because a lot of the proposals that you're getting, both sides are trying to figure out what really are you trying to accomplish, and we wanted to make sure that we had the opportunity to figure out from the proposers if they could meet our goals. So we use this process of a best value, which is essentially giving yourself a little bit more flexibility in how you approach the proposal process, asking follow-up questions, and trying to build up areas on a proposal that maybe you otherwise like, and get it to where the proposal you go with is the one that provides the best value to the organization. And then really quick, just a couple of pitfalls that I wanted to mention through the process is definitions really do matter, especially in something like this. And the on-demand versus on-demand definition that I wanted to highlight is when we went through the process, in my mind, on demand just meant you didn't necessarily have a fixed schedule. When we were talking with the proposers, it became clear that on demand has lots of different meanings. And one of them could be on demand means there is no schedule before the person requests it, meaning pre-booking in a paratransit sense isn't on demand. That's pre-booking. Does that make sense? And that becomes actually an important distinction in terms of how you communicate to the rider and how they book a trip, to say like, the only way that you can book a trip is in the moment. Like right now, I want to go out and find a trip. That in their mind was on demand. If no schedule, there's no schedule or routes out there, but I want to go tomorrow, and so I want to go and schedule the trip, that in their mind wasn't on demand. Does that make sense? But when we were thinking about the service provision, I was thinking I wanted that to be seamless. Whether I'm trying to schedule the trip now or in 2 days, that's still kind of on demand. But so when you get into these questions with the proposers, just make sure that you talk through, like, what does that look like? How does that work with their software, their algorithms, because it makes a difference. And so this is a little bit what I was describing there in terms of dynamic scheduling versus pre-booking and how all of those are optimized. Sometimes maybe the approach is that pre-booking and dynamic scheduling happen in entirely different, universes. That optimization process isn't an integrated process. Knowing that matters because it means things in terms of how the rider is going to experience transit. And none of us knew any of this when we started the process. So the other thing that I would say is, if you're not already a software expert on on-demand services, do interviews before you start the RFP process. Like, find somebody that you know is in this space, talk to them about how their process works, and probe a little bit to figure out, like, what are the things that are going to be most important to us and in the application that we're trying to do for on-demand service. And then I guess the last thing is just the way data is stored and used matters as well. Making sure that, and most of them were good about, showing that the data is really accessible and meets NTD requirements. But it does raise interesting questions. I think I saw a question in there about, is on-demand motor bus or is it paratransit in terms of NTD? And I believe we're reporting our on-demand services as motor bus. They're not paratransit. We're using what used to be fixed route vehicles and stops to do it. But it really does come down to, like, figuring out what is the specific use case. In our case, it was, we wanted to constrain the number of places that people could get on and off the bus. So it wasn't door to door, it was stop to stop, with an expansion of stops, with creating a bunch of virtual stops to extend the reach of service. So I guess those would be kind of my main points, is make sure to talk to people before you start the process, so you have an idea of how you would, because then you can structure that into your proposal, right? Like, I know that I want this to be stop to stop. I know that I want to use existing transit vehicles, because you'll get proposals and it'll be easy to make a distinction. I guess that would be another thing that I would mention, is we were surprised at both the number of proposals we got and where we got them from. It was an international pool of our proposals that we got. And so that's both exciting, but also it just means you got to sift through a lot. And it should, what we saw is there was a pretty quick separation between, like, paratransit type operators that were hearing on demand and saw their services as doing that, and then people who were trying to do Lyft and Uber, and people who were trying to do something that is a little bit more like fixed route transit that is scheduled on demand, which is essentially where we were trying to go as well. So I hope some of that's helpful, and those were the thoughts that I wanted to share. Thanks.
Very good, Stephen. I really appreciate the depth and level of detail there, and agree with you on a number of those points. And just for clarity, you ended up selecting who for your provider at the end of the day?
We ended up going with VIA, and one of the reasons that we went with VIA is because, so again, this stuff matters because there was an easier crossover into paratransit. So once you start to say like, all right, we can do this on-demand stuff for fixed route, why am I not doing on-demand booking for paratransit? Like, why am I still saying that you have to call 24 hours in advance to book a paratransit ride? Can we have a single system that allows like everybody to do all of that was important to us. And so that wasn't exactly how we've deployed it yet, but we were thinking about what our next steps might be and wanted that to be an option.
Perfect. Just want to be clear that both of you are not using Pantonium. So Sam, I'll get you to unmute. We're going to get into some meaty questions now. We've got quite a few to get through, and I think that I'd like each of you to kind of comment on some of them. So one popular question is from Rick. We'd like to understand, okay, you've told us how you designed the RFP and how you've got to implementation. What does success mean, right? And I think it's an interesting question because there's a lot of tendency to measure it just on numbers alone and performance. But what does success actually mean for each of you? Briefly, please. Start with Sam. Give you a bit of a break, Stephen. So.
Right. So it is a good question. And you're right, Jeremy. You can't get lost in the numbers. You can start going. There's so many different things you can measure. But I think what's important here, what we got to boil it down to is, again, going back to our goal. We're trying to provide a service more efficiently so that we can try to actually see if we can get additional services. Can we go a further distance? So we're really looking, or different hours, additional hours. So what we're really looking at is, again, we had 8 buses out there on Saturdays. So can we do it with less? Same service area, same kind of ridership or demand. If we do that and we know we're getting less, we've got something. That means we can start to do something more, or we can also save some money, which we know as financing is difficult. The other side of that is, of course, you got to make sure it's also something that the customers, appreciate, like, value, and those are things that are a little harder to measure. And those are things that we're looking at, through surveys or other things. So. Those really are the 2 main things that we're looking at right now.
Very good.
I thought I knew the answer to this question, and it was going to be boardings per hour, kind of plain and simple. We want to see an increase in productivity and a decrease in cost per boarding. But what's been interesting to watch as this is rolled out is the increase in customer satisfaction, just like how people are perceiving the service, and the number of people who are saying, hey, like I can take transit now and I couldn't take it before. And the general feeling towards the services has been actually quite positive, like 4.5 plus out of 5 stars. But our productivity is not there. But I think the people who are wanting the service, namely are the College of Western Idaho, the city of Nampa, if they see that their residents like it more, that might be the win, right? So in the end, I'm no longer as certain as I was going into this as to what the measures of success end up being, because I was hoping that it was all going to be about efficiency, and it would be really you'd clearly be able to see like this is more efficient or less efficient and be able to move on. But if it's less efficient and people like it more and they're willing to pay for it, I don't know if that's not a win anymore. So it's been interesting to watch.
And I think that gets to the deployment types, right? So if you're looking at a suburban style deployment with a wide service area and folks can get to where they need to get to, like you say, there's food deserts and things like that, then, that is the win, but maybe in Sam's case where he needs to service a lot of people using fewer assets, maybe boardings per hour are more important there, right? So I think that the goals shift based on the type of deployment that you're looking to put out.
And if I could add one more thing, like one of the things that was hardest about this transition though was seeing the impact that it has on existing riders. And so fixed route is great because the barriers to entry are essentially a fare, right? I mean, you need to know kind of where it's at and everything, but otherwise you can just go out, get the bus whenever it's coming. And when we were doing in the run up to the changeover, it was heartbreaking in my own experience to see people who were like, they just aren't going to do this new service because they don't have we had people who only had access. They didn't have internet at home. They didn't have a landline at home. They just had a cell phone, but they were using Wi-Fi was their only access to data. So the only place that they could request the ride would be where there was already Wi-Fi. On the bus, they could do it, but you can't do it on the bus if you're not on the bus. And so those things are real barriers. And it hasn't been easy for me to think through, like, what does this mean from an equity perspective? And I'm still not settled as to kind of where that all lands. But this question of like, what's success look like at some level is, for us anyways, what are people willing to fund? And that's been interesting to watch, I guess is all I can say.
And if I can add to that quickly, because we're just really new into this. I mean, it's very, only 6 weeks into it, 6 days into it, really. And we're seeing some of the same things where there's a lot of people that don't have access to what's required for a satisfying on-demand service. But what's interesting about this is what I'm finding is one of the wins is the data that you get.
Yes.
We're getting real clear origin and destination data that you can't get on any fixed route service very easily. I mean, I'm not saying you can't do it, but here you can get it very easily because you know where people are starting their trip and where they're ending their trip. So now with a lot of the people that do need or do not have the cell phone service, the smartphone, the service, maybe you can start to see where those trips are going to for a lot of those people. This is what we're hoping and what we're looking at. Maybe then we can start to bring in some kind of a limited fixed route service for those kind of trips that are needed. So I think either way, that there's a win right there. There's success right there.
Yeah, I agree 100%. A lot of people want your RFPs. They want the hard copies. They want the references, right? And I've seen this. I know you probably saw this. Folks in the Q&A are talking about how there is no repository of on-demand transit RFPs, like reference documents. Things that maybe the transit association should be collecting to help create a reference library for people. But I want to ask, is that legal? Can these documents be shared after, like if you're not a plan taker or if you didn't download it, can we share those documents with other folks?
My understanding, the RFP can be shared. The proposals, not so much, but the RFP itself could be shared. And
so maybe we need to start pushing to create a repository of historical on-demand RFPs to be searchable in some location. So,
yeah, we could certainly provide that. I would have to get approval for sure, but I'm like Stephen. I think the same thing. I mean, we put it up on our public website, so I'm sure it's it's public there too for everybody.
So, a couple of people are asking about integration with other platforms. Was that considered important when you're putting this out into the world here, like Annunciation or GTFS or other types of services that are being used for transit? Was that a requirement or is that a nice to have right now?
Right now, it's kind of a nice to have. I mean, we're looking at a lot of different things, and as part of our core team process, there were other things like that, the technology items, like you said, annunciators, or trying to interface that with mobile ticketing systems and other data that you can gain from, you know, updates of your fare boxes, all kinds of things like that. Real-time GPS. You know, but I think you got to, you know, this technology thing, I think you got to, I don't think you can go into it and say we're going to do a comprehensive change. There's just no way easy that I've seen of doing that. So you got to kind of take it in nice bite-sized pieces. So.
Are either of your projects interfacing with any other hardware or platform?
I don't think ours is. I mean, you know, yeah, it really is, you know, bringing in this case, Pantonium's software, and being able to utilize that for on-demand services. But at this point, we're not. I mean, it would be nice eventually to interface it with our fare box or, you know, mobile ticketing systems. And I think those are things that you would eventually be trying to look at.
Yeah, right. We're the same way. I mean, we have, what do they call them? I don't know if they're like deep links, but in terms of like true integration, no. One of the challenges that we have is trip planning, where particularly because, so our service runs Monday through Friday, different than SAM. And there actually are other fixed route services in Canyon County where this on-demand service is operating Monday through Friday. They're just not the local services. So if you wanted to plan a trip from Boise to Nampa that went on an inter-county and then onto the local, we don't have a seamless way of doing that because that trip plan would require you to book a trip on the on-demand service. So that connection is challenging. And so those are some of the things we had to think through in terms of what do we communicate to the rider on our trip planning thing that says, I want to do this trip from Boise to Nampa, and it says you can't do it. Or it says, this is what you take, and then you need to book a ride once you get into Nampa, right? Just the logic of that is some stuff that we had to work out on our website. And then Sam mentioned the data, which is really robust, and that's one of the big advantages that we also saw with our funding partners about on-demand transit. But that's another thing that needs to get integrated. Our ridership data, I mean, it can come through the GFI fare box, but it's different. It's not associated with a block or a route anymore, and if we have, so in our case, we have one person maybe who's booking multiple trips and they're not, it just gets harder to do a direct match of that data stream and maybe your GFI data stream and ridership data stream. And so if you're trying, yes, we have NTD data for on demand, but usually we're talking about NTD data for the whole agency. And so you still have to figure out a way to merge those two streams.
Right. What about funding? You know, you've got some funding to launch the program. How will you fund it in perpetuity if you like it? You know, is it just another operational cost, or will you still rely on some federal funding to keep it operational? What's the plan after year one?
So for us, again, I mean, we've got a little bit of funding to help us, you know, in terms of, you know, the licensing of the software, you know, that you would have, and a little bit of the pilot. But again, long term, you know, this has to pay for itself. I mean, if our goal is to try to do things with less buses, then you're doing it and trying to show a cost benefit analysis. You know, the benefits outweigh the costs, and that's what would be doing in this particular case. We're not doing the additional services would be because it's more efficient and you can do more with less.
And Stephen?
Well, for us, it's easy in the sense that the ongoing support of this is coming through our contributions from those local jurisdictions. So CWI and the city of Nampa, we're paying into an operating budget, and that operating budget is what set the cap, so to speak, for how much on-demand service we're providing to the region. So it's as sustainable as the fixed route service was before it. But again, that's why I come back to a little bit when we define success. The success of it is kind of like how much are people willing to pay for it,
right?
Because that was the principal driver for going to on-demand in the first place. Was we had our funding partners weren't convinced that the services that they were getting were worth the money that they were paying, and so we're trying something new. And if that's whatever combination of reasons they have for that, more people can have access to it, or people are more satisfied with it, or on-time performance is better, or what have you. That's all that goes into the mix.
So I think we're getting to the end of our official time. And so I'd like to, for recording purposes, thank everybody for attending. But I'd also like to say if people have time and they want to stay on to ask a few more questions, maybe Sam or Stephen, if you have 10 minutes, would you be willing to stick on a little longer? Is that okay?
Yeah, I have time.
It's okay by me.
So, so I'll say thank you to all the attendees and participants for taking time, for Stephen and Sam for taking time to prepare, lessons learned for on-demand transit RFPs. And we will have another webinar coming up about developing business cases. So stay tuned for that. And you can go to pantonium.com to sign up for our newsletter or follow us on any social media. And appreciate everyone's time today, and thank you for attending.